let's have a look at exactly that, an example of this. Paper I've written myself, so it's good. So this is a paper that I'm working on about the Man Gulch disaster. It's part of the sense-making tradition, very famous disaster. And you'll notice, I'm not going to read it all for you, but you'll notice that the world that I'm starting us in is just a world in which a disaster in fact happened. Right? I'm just saying, you dear reader are not going to be surprised to learn that there was a disaster. Here are some details about it. Right? And I'm really just telling a gripping and thrilling story, a tragic story even, right? But it's an exciting story. It has some drama in it, right? And that's a good way of introducing, right? Just tell a story. You can also tell a history, like tell the history of something, or like I say, provide some statistics and so forth, right? I then started with a consensus. So there's a consensus in the field, and you'll notice if you go about 2/3 of the way down that there are some references there. And the whole idea there is to make sure that if you're going to say there's a consensus about this, that you invoke people that represent that consensus, right? So these will be leading figures in the field. Carl Weick certainly is a leading figure in the field. And that there's a certain agreement about what happened in this disaster, what the causes of it were, right? And one way of summarizing that is that there was what they call a cosmology episode, right? And then we get to, in this paper, I show that sense-making did not play a significant role in the death of the smoke jumpers in Man Gulch, right? Which is a bit of a disappointment for sense-making researchers who would like everything to proceed according to the rules of sense-making. Right? Does that make sense? So that's the kind of logic that we have of that. And if you work through that paragraph, you'll see that I've tried as best as I can to really follow my own rules. I've said on what basis, so what kind of reading I'm going to do. I'm going to do allegoric breaching, which is a little bit like saying semi-structured interviews, right? It's a methodology, it's a reading strategy for your data, right? And then I summarize what I discover, and then I say near the end there, this reading should get us to rethink, which is to say, it has the following implications. Does that make sense? Now, this is the magic moment, because I have to show you that all of this actually gives you a structure for the entire paper, right? And it is quite important to keep that in mind, that if you've written these 3 paragraphs, what you've done is you've trained your vision of the entire paper, right? You've written these 3 paragraphs, and you've set yourself up to write the entire rest of it, which is to say that after those 3 minutes of reading, the reader has been set up to read, right? Obviously, the introduction itself is the introduction, so that's covered, right? So that's just, the one is the same as the other. The first paragraph has clearly introduced your background, right? It has started you down the road of the background. You can spend the rest of the background section unpacking that. In this case, I might say even more about the disaster, or I might broaden my view a little bit, really put in a background and say, well, what about disaster management in general, and so forth, right? So it gives me a way of starting in on my background section, right? It gives me something to refer to when I start my background section. The second paragraph that starts the science, obviously, is introducing the theory, right? So we have introduced the theory now. The first couple of sentences of the third paragraph introduce the method. They tell the reader what my methods are going to be. The analysis is then summarized. I've tried to be pedagogical, so about 3 points of the analysis, which has about 3 sections. So you'll probably want to do it roughly like that, right? A sentence, or maybe even half a sentence per section of your analysis, depending on if you have a 6-section analysis, then you may not want to use 6 sentences in that paragraph. So you'll find out how to do it in half sentences. And of course, the discussion is summarized at the end. And just to put a button on it, yes, the conclusion is mentioned in the introduction, so the reader also knows where we're going. And most readers like that, right? Most readers don't want to be surprised at the end. They do want you to announce what you're on about, what you're going to try to do, so that the reader can activate the correct critical posture and apparatus for understanding this. Let's summarize this. Here's really the core, like if you really take the machine and just trim it down so it has no dead weight, right? And the only thing that your machine is going to do, right, is just its main point. Then we have it here, right? We have that first sentence in the third paragraph. This paper shows that the Mann Gulch disaster was not a cosmology episode. I've changed a little bit here just to simplify it. Notice something important about this sentence. You don't know what it means if you don't know what a cosmology episode is, right? And what that tells you is something important about that sentence. It's the key sentence of the third paragraph. And what you want to make sure is that it's theoretically loaded, right? So it only makes sense. Its meaning is derived from theory, right? You're going to use words in it, concepts in it, that only a theorist would understand. That's how you know you've written that sentence right. If there's no theoretical language in it, it's not a good concluding sentence. But notice something else, right? That it's only true based on the data. It's only if I'm right in my reading of the Mann Gulch disaster, right, that this sentence is true. So it's empirically true, but theoretically meaningful, right? Does that make sense? And notice this, right? The only difference between these two sentences is those 4 words, I guess, but the most important ones are those first 3. This paper shows, right? And that's what makes the first sentence part of the introduction and the second sentence part of the conclusion, right? Is that in the introduction we're going to describe the paper, right? In the conclusion we're going to assert the conclusion, right? We're going to say what we mean because we've earned that right. Yeah? So here we are. This is the machine you're trying to build. You recognize that it has some stable structures and some working parts, right? And you also recognize that it's going to take about 60, 80, 120 minutes to read, right? Because it's 1 minute per paragraph. And you want to make sure that each of your paragraphs delivers a point into this structure, right? So the argument flows, and so that you understand what the overall effect is that you're trying to have.